You're listening to the Authorpreneur podcast, episode number 20. Welcome to the Authorpreneur podcast. I'm your host, thriller writer Amelia Hay. On this podcast, I will bring you writing, book marketing, and self-publishing advice so that you can create your dream author business, build your author platform, and be creatively independent. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information on the podcast page at ameliahay.com/podcast. Hello writers, so you've reached the start of the third act of your outline or in your first draft and you're not sure how to propel your protagonist from the second act to the third act. There is a scene and story structure that creates a doorway or a transition between the final two acts. It's generally referred to as the second turning point, second plot point, or the dark night of the soul. If this is something you're struggling with as you're writing your first draft or brainstorming your story outline, then this episode is for you. In this episode, I will discuss the essential elements and provide 5 tips on how to write a compelling Dark Night of the Soul scene. So let's get started. Before I dive into the writing tips, this is the 9th installment in my series on 3-act structure. If you've just joined me on this episode, I will link the previous 8 episodes in the show notes over on my blog. You can find the show notes at ameliahay.com/dark-night. The Dark Night of the Soul needs to occur at the beginning or slightly before the 75th percent mark in your story, or even as early as the 70% mark, and can span over several scenes depending on the length of your story. The third act should begin with another life-changing but nonetheless impossible plot point that brings the protagonist and the plot back to its central theme. This moment causes the hero to look within and find the courage to go on in it amidst defeat and move towards the final conflict and climax of the story. Now that we've established what the story element is, it's time to discuss how to write a compelling Dark Night of the Soul scene. As I've looked back on my fiction novels and stories written by other screenwriters and authors, created a list of 5 tips designed to help you write a page-turning scene. I know this sounds like a lot of things to think about as you write or outline, but I wanted to break down the elements so it's easy for you to follow. Tip number 1, put your protagonist in an impossible situation. Yes, this means there's more pain ahead for your protagonist. As the name suggests, it's your main character's darkest moment. They're now faced in an impossible situation that they perceive as hopeless. In fact, it seems impossible, but not just for your protagonist. The reader needs to believe this as well. It's in this moment that the protagonist realizes there's no going back. The only option is to face the impossibility of the challenge ahead. And this means striving towards the goal in amidst adversity. All of this is often done without the support of allies the protagonist had relied upon before. He's all alone. So what does an impossible situation look like in the mystery, thriller, or romance genres? In a mystery, figuring out the truth seems impossible. In a thriller, the antagonistic force seems to have won. In a romance, the hero loses all hope of getting the girl or vice versa. It's a moment of despair. Tip number 2, provide a believable solution. Even though the situation the protagonist is in seems impossible, the solution to the problem needs to be believable. This means your protagonist needs to draw from his strengths and talents to overcome the challenge presented by the Dark Night of the Soul. So that's no to moments where other supporting characters rush in to save the day. I'm also not saying that your protagonist can't get any aid from an ally, but they need to be the one who saves the day in the end. Another moment you should avoid in the third act is your protagonist suddenly having a special talent or skill that conveniently gets him out of trouble. These special talents need to be foreshadowed earlier on in the story, just like in the Hunger Games. Earlier in the story, the author points out Katniss's archery skills, which later come in handy during the games and is one of the things that help her to survive. This foreshadowing makes the victory believable. Tip number 3, let theme play a central role. Theme is at the heart of the dark night of the soul scenes and the final scenes in your story. When you've just started out, writing theme can be a confusing story element. So what is the theme of a story? In a nutshell, your story theme is what your story is really all about. It's your protagonist's inner motivation, but it becomes universal within the story. The dark night of the soul often reflects upon the theme of your protagonist, and it forces the hero to confront his feelings about the events that have unfolded in the story. If you're writing a longer story like a novel, you may want to include a separate reaction scene where your protagonist comes to terms with how he feels and give the theme a more significant moment. Tip number 4, the dark night of the soul should trigger a moment of truth. As a part of the dark night of the soul moment, there is a transition between hopelessness and determination. It's not until someone hits rock bottom that he or she finds the determination to move forward despite the odds. This is the moment that comes before the protagonist takes the final actionable steps towards his goal. It's in the moment of truth that the protagonist finds his determination. In this scene, we see the protagonist at his lowest emotional point and on the verge of giving up. However, this moment of truth is what the protagonist needs to reflect upon the journey thus far. It's within thoughtful reflection that he summons the courage to prepare for the final showdown with the antagonistic force. Tip number 5, set the protagonist on the path towards the final conflict. The third act will begin with another life-changing plot point. It's important that this moment sets the protagonist's feet on the path towards the final conflict in the climax of your story. Even though life is often illogical, your story doesn't have that luxury. Your story needs to make sense. There needs to be a logical sequence between the opening of the third act and the climax of your story. However, this doesn't mean you can't surprise the reader. Your protagonist needs to go from their darkest and lowest moment to engaging in a conflict with the antagonistic force. It's the role of the dark night of the soul scenes to point the protagonist in this direction. In a romance, the hero loses all hope of getting the girl, but finds the courage to put his heart on the line and win her back. The actual winning the love interest back is the climactic moment of a romance novel, but the path needs to be set in motion in the dark night of the soul moments. Are you struggling to write the dark night of the soul scene for your novel? I want to hear from you. Let me know by coming over to the show notes for this episode at ameliahay.com/dark-night and let me know in the comments section where you're struggling and the steps you're going to take to improve your story. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Authorpreneur podcast, where I'll discuss how to write the climactic sequence of your novel. Happy writing, everybody! Thank you for listening to the Authorpreneur podcast. If you're new to this podcast or want to be notified about more episodes just like this, then click the subscribe button right now. I'm your host, Amelia Hay, and I'll see you next week for another episode.